Hey folks, welcome. I am Ariana Taylor Stanley. I will be hosting along with Alexis today, and I just want to welcome folks and invite folks who are on the call on your computers who are able to see the screen to share a little bit of information about yourself, just so we can tell who's here in this cyber room today. So I put a slide, thanks Alexis for putting it up, that just invites you to share your name, the preferred pronouns you like folks to use to refer to you, gender-wise, and your organization. So if you're a farmer, the name of your farm, or if you're in school or work for a company or nonprofit, any of those things, where you're calling in from today, your location, and a little bit of stuff that's related to our conversation today. So have you used any USD programs in the past? Because that's what we're going to focus on today. Just curious kind of what folks' background is like on this. And one thing that you're hoping to get out of this webinar, one reason that you attended today. So we'll let folks trickle in for a little while longer, if folks can just share some of your details. And thanks Whitney and Ned for getting us going. Yay. Thank you so much, everyone who's sharing your intros in the chat. This is so great. I'm glad to have all of you here. Hooray. Welcome, Coralie. Hey, Coralie. Hannah, Chelsea, Samantha. Welcome, welcome. I see we got lots of folks on. If you're just joining us and you haven't had the chance yet, please feel free to share some info about you in the chat. I see we've got Susan and Gabriel and another Hannah, perhaps. I think, yes, 2 Hannahs, great. And Tanya, hey Tanya. So awesome to have all of you here and see all of your faces. Yay. Okay, we're gonna get rolling in just like a couple more minutes. Let a few more folks trickle in.
Hi, I'm Joe Soto over from TSIC.
Hey Joe, yay, welcome.
Hi.
Glad to have you.
And while we're waiting a couple more minutes, I'm just going to, I'm so appreciative of Ariana for having this amazing opening slide. We'll be asking her permission after this webinar to see if Groundswell can use some of these ideas, because it's so useful. It's like usually for our Farming for Justices, we have this like a few opening slides, which are really nice, but this right here is way more useful in creating community. So I will take a moment to introduce Ariana, who is here today from the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, and who is a local farmer here in Ithaca, New York. Technically, she's in Trumansburg. And our Farming for Justice is a monthly discussion group, which is turning into more of a discussion-based webinar, because we are no longer offering it in office and only offering it via Zoom, and all of our webinars are recorded. So this month, we know what we're here for. And next month, our Farming for Justice is going to be on community emergency food systems with some farmers from Appalachia. March, we still have open, so if anybody here has any ideas or would like to facilitate a Farming for Justice, please shoot me an email, because we still have March available. In April, we'll have Letitia Wyatt from Soul Fire Farms talking about fat phobia in food justice spaces and how structurally that is still an issue. And after that, we still have many months available if anybody, again, has interest in referring somebody or signing up for yourself. And so as everybody is starting to trickle in, and as Ariana has been sharing here, please put your name and your pronouns in the chat box, your organization, your location, whether or not you've used any USDA programs in the past and something you'd like to learn today, because that's why we're here. And before we get started, I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we're on here. Here at Groundswell Center at the southern end of Cayuga Lake, we're on traditional Gayokono territory. Many people know as the Cayuga Nation, who are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. This land that we're here on in Ithaca is very sacred to them. There are many burial grounds, and oftentimes people forget that the land that they walk on is very sacred and many people died on it. And also not to discount the history of slavery in the area as well. And so I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that, also to acknowledge the fact that the Gayokono have not been in this area for almost 200 years, and they started coming back from Canada where they were displaced. And so it's significant to learn our history of the land that we're on and how we're affecting, the Indigenous people around us and the Indigenous communities, the Black communities, and learn about histories in order to be able to create better relationships with each other. So other than that, I just want to say after today's webinar, I will be sending a link with an evaluation form, and filling this very short evaluation form is really necessary to keep this programming going. It just takes a few minutes, and then we really take your feedback seriously. It does affect our future programming, but also ensures that we have the funding to keep this programming going. So otherwise, I'm just going to turn it back over to Ariana and learn about programs that we have available to us as historically underserved farmers.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alexis. And thank you, Alexis and Groundswell, for hosting this series. It's really lovely to see how it's evolved and have 33 folks on the line today, and so many familiar faces and brand new faces for me. So I'm just really grateful to be in the space with you all, and really excited to have this conversation. So yeah, Alexis, could you just go advance? And I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to do the thing where I ask Alexis to advance my slides because I couldn't figure out the screen sharing. So that way you get to see my face at the same time.
Slide 3.
Yeah, there you go. So that's me. Oh, for some reason, I'm getting like some drawing on top of the slides. I don't know if that's my fault. I don't know how it happened. There's like some blue lines. Do you all see that too? I don't know if there's a way to fix it, but It might be on Alexis's end, and if so, oh, Chelsea says yes. Chelsea sees the blue lines. Maybe there's a way to undo. Maybe if you just do command undo or something, but it's not a huge deal, whatever. So yes, hello and welcome. And Alexis already gave me a lovely introduction, so thank you for that. This is what I normally look like when it's not winter. I, as Alexis mentioned, run a small vegetable farm right outside Ithaca, New York. We grow mixed vegetables for CSA, community supported agriculture, and farmers markets. I work a plot of 12 acres of land, which we hold the deed to, although it's, as Alexis mentioned, stolen land from the Gaekono people. One of those acres is currently in vegetables. That's what you see in the picture. This is going to be my 10th season as a farmer and my 4th season working on land that I hold the deed to, which is a huge and complicated privilege. And I just wanted to add some context, like because I farm and I'm talking about farm programs, I'm going to be able to use some of my own history and talk about like some of my own experience using these programs. And I'm white, as you might be able to tell by look at me, but not necessarily. So I just want to be clear that we're talking today, especially about programs that farmers of color can access. And I'm going to use my example, my personal example, because it's readily at hand. But obviously that might be a bit different than the experience a farmer of color might have walking into the doors of USDA. So I just wanted to put that out there from the beginning. I also, as you may have noticed, work for a fabulous organization that's based in DC, the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. And I serve as the Northeast Regional Organizer for NSAC. That's our kind of unfortunate acronym. I cover New York State and the New England states. So that's my focus. And if you can go to the next slide, I'll just tell you a tiny bit about what NSAC does. Thank you much. So here's some of us at NSAC. We are a big coalition of over 120 organizations all around the country. Most of them are like state and regional organizations. Examples in the Northeast include the NOFA, Northeast Organic Farming Association chapter, so you might be familiar with them, or in New York City, Just Food is a member. So organizations that mostly work with folks like in their small regional areas, maybe provide direct support, but want to have a voice in federal policy. Next slide, please. Thank you. That's where a whole bunch of our members are. And then if you go to the next slide, there you go. So we use this process that you see on this slide. All our members like mostly spend their time not thinking about policy, but they want to have a voice in it. So they kind of get together, get feedback from farmers, and then set our priorities as a coalition. And then our staff in DC and out here regionally work together to help turn those priorities into real life programs that can benefit farmers or changes when stuff isn't working well for farmers. And we often bring you all back into that work when strategic, in the form of asking you to call your members of Congress or show up to a farmer fly-in. And I will share many times the link to our email sign-up form if you would like to be plugged into some of that work moving forward. I'm going to do a thing where I attempt to kind of keep you engaged in a dynamic way. Webinars are not always the easiest to stay awake during or focus during. I know we have so much that we all need to do in our lives. And so I'm going to try and like keep giving you different types of input, things you can do so that you can like stay plugged in, feed your need for like information or kind of wandering brain if you have a wandering brain like mine. And one of the ways I'm going to do that is I'm going to try and give you like links that relate to the things I'm talking about. If you want to like go off and do a little research, that might also help if you have more background on some of, I'm going to do some very intro level overviews of some of the programs I talk about. So if you've already heard of it and you're ready, you're like, oh yeah, that thing, I've meant to research more. I'll put you the link and you can go off and find your own information about that. I'll try and keep that up. That's kind of a new learning stretch for me, doing that in Zoom. So feel free to remind me if you're not seeing any links and you're curious, but I'll try and toss those out there in the Zoom. And I just did that first with, like, if you want to get updates from NSAC about what's happening in the world of federal policy, or like what you can do to take action, there you go. All right. And let's see, one other way I want folks to be able to interact in this webinar. Actually, let's go, can you please go to the next slide? Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do in today's conversation. So I have two goals. One of them is to just kind of give you some background. I think whenever we talk about these programs, you can totally use, like, sign up today. Many of them are open at this exact moment. This timing is really nice. Thank you, Groundswell. I think for me, it's always helpful to have a little bit of history about, like, where do these programs come from? What's the deal policy-wise? So we're going to get some background, and that's going to include some history that speaks to, why does this workshop have to focus on programs that support farmers of color? Like, why are farmers of color not just being supported by USDA's existing programs? There's a lot of history there. So we're going to have some of that, talk about some of the baked in racial injustice in our farm policy. And then the exciting part, I mean, that should be exciting too, but then we're going to have some time to talk about a few farm programs that you as a farmer can sign up for right now. And if you are someone that supports farmers, you can listen with that lens. Or if you're someone that works in a nonprofit organization, we'll talk about some programs that are applicable to you. And I better give a caveat right here that there are many, many, many federal farm programs that may apply to you that you could use. And I am not going to talk about all of them, because all I would do is just say the name and then say the next name and then say the next name, and it would be a really boring and overwhelming webinar. So in lieu of that, I am going to give you some detailed information about a few programs that I think might be especially relevant to the work that you're all doing. I said there's a long list. I'm pasting in a link to our long list of all the federal programs in the Farm Bill. There you go. There's a lot. Note that there's a column that says O and F, whether you're an organization or a farmer. So you can apply your identity to that column. So I'm not going to talk about every program, but there you go. There's your list. And if you have questions, I will try a little bit to read what's happening in the Zoom, but I may get distracted if I try and do too much. But please feel free, if you have a burning question about something I said, or you want to clarify, or I use an acronym and I don't explain it, and you need to give me a demerit for that. We really try to spell out acronyms and be really clear. Please feel free to ask a question in the Zoom chat or pipe up on the call with audio. And there will be time for more questions at the end. I will try to save about 15 minutes so we can have more back and forth and get into detail about, like, particular programs folks are interested in using. Whew, okay, that was a bit more intro than intended. So let's dive right in. Here are the two pieces. Next slide, that's great, thank you. 2 parts. 1, Farm Bill Basics. 2, programs you can use. Let's dive right into part 1. Next slide. All right. So we are going to do a little bit of history and context. And before I dive into that, I just want to give some acknowledgement that the next few slides I'm going to use were developed by many of my colleagues at NSAC, and I've listed many of their names there, as well as other folks who gave relevant presentations that we attended, that we borrowed ideas from. So credit where credit is due there. The map that you're looking at is a map that shows the actual visual, what it looked like, piece of land theft. And let me give you more context for that in the next slide. So agriculture in this country, it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it at the beginning here, agriculture in the US is built on a legacy of stolen indigenous land and stolen African labor. And that didn't happen by mistake, it happened through policy. So as we talk about policy in this workshop, we're going to do it through that lens, and that influences who uses programs and who doesn't, and everything else that flows from there. And I appreciate Alexis's acknowledgement that we here are on stolen or unceded Gaikana land. That's where I'm sitting as well. If you are also wondering about whose land you occupy, I'm going to paste a handy link into the chat for you to be able to look up a map and find whose historical territories you occupy. So the history behind that starts with policy. So US policy structured our system of ag around structural racial inequity since the beginning of this country, since before the beginning of this country. That started with unfair treaties that forced indigenous people off their land, moving to homestead acts that gave that land away to white families to farm explicitly. That policy, along with a state-sponsored genocide, supported the transfer of land that had been stewarded by indigenous people into white management. And at the same time, the economic system of slavery, which was upheld in policies from Fugitive Slave Acts to the Constitution, provided white landowning farmers immense wealth through generations of forced labor and, of course, accompanying brutality and loss of life. The use of the labor of enslaved people generated trillions of dollars for white landowners. That's the context that we're working. That's the undeniable ground level piece of history. And throughout US history, federal policies continued to uphold the interests of white people. And, because history began with so many people farming, that means white people owning land. And that's happened moving from systems that, like these systems, directly provide resources to white people, taking those resources from groups of color, moving through policies that explicitly prohibit groups from owning land. So examples include our immigration policies, like the Chinese Exclusion Act, that explicitly only allowed US citizens to own land and excluded groups of color from citizenship. The examples that sort of brought this forward include the Bracero program, allowing Latinx folks to come to the country to work, but not to accumulate wealth or own land. And that all those systems benefit, those systems have moved to today where the emphasis in policy is on programs that benefit those with the historical access to land. So we no longer need policies that explicitly say we are going to take land from people of color, although those happen implicitly. We no longer need to have policies that say you are no longer allowed to have land and wealth because you're not white. Now we can have policies that say, if you have acreage, here is a conservation payment that's per acre so that you can use this program. Those policies have the exact same impact because of the history. We can now use colorblind, so-called colorblind policy language to uphold, maintain, and reinforce the systems of white supremacy on which our food system's built. So if you can go to my next slide, we're gonna talk about what that looks like in terms of agriculture policy as we sort of move throughout time. So the systems of agriculture that European Americans practiced on the stolen land that the government took from indigenous people and gave them access to at great loss of life, and using the scales of practices only made possible by using labor of enslaved people, those systems of agriculture turned out not to be particularly effective, not to be particularly sustainable on the land in the Americas. And those systems of agriculture quickly degraded that land that sustained indigenous people for millennia and led to environmental catastrophes like the one in this picture, the Dust Bowl, which paralleled the economic imbalances that powered the Great Depression. And so we're going to talk about federal farm policy. The first farm bill was in response to this. So, let's emphasize we're looking at a policy that arose in response to an environmental catastrophe caused by practices that were unsustainable on stolen land by people that didn't bother to find out what was working on that land. And so we need a policy in response. And early farm bills did a bunch of things. The first farm bill was part of the New Deal. We're talking a lot these days about a potential Green New Deal. So it's interesting to go back and reflect on the farm bill having come out of the original New Deal. And early farm bills addressed both the overproduction that was coming out of these systems of agriculture and the existing environmental and economic problems for farmers. And they addressed the poverty that accompanied that on and off farms. So they did that by fostering conservation and seeking to balance the farm economy by paying farmers to take some land out of production. As a farmer, my individual economic incentive, if the markets are flooded and prices are low, the only thing I can do to control how much money I'm going to make off what I grow, I can't control the price, but I can control how much I grow. So my incentive if prices are low is I can plant more. But obviously that furthers the problem, especially if I'm doing that in a way that's causing environmental catastrophes like the Dust Bowl. So early farm bills reverse that economic incentive by giving farmers the resources by just paying them to not farm. So that both helped mitigate some of the environmental problems as well as taking some land out of production, reducing some of the overproduction, and reducing, sort of balancing the economy that way. Early farm bills also redistributed some of the surplus crops being produced to hungry people, creating our sort of first food aid systems that look a lot different now, but they're still incorporated in that same piece of policy we call the Farm Bill. And early farm bills also did something called setting price floors, kind of like a minimum wage for farmers. And so while this was fairly effective at mitigating some of the really severe challenges of this era, they didn't actually address the underlying institutional racism that had started the problem. And in fact, the Farm Bill and other New Deal programs continued the pattern of structural racism, and many New Deal programs explicitly excluded communities of color. Two other New Deal programs, minimum wage laws and Social Security, were written to exclude domestic workers and farm workers, which again is an example of colorblind language, because nowhere in there does it say African American workers, but at the time those jobs were primarily held by African American workers, and that was an explicit compromise between lawmakers in the North and South to pass the New Deal that was built on the back of the racist intention to leave out African American workers from New Deal programs. And at the same time, so the Farm Bill programs, the conservation programs that were paying farmers to take land out of production, et cetera, those were left up to the discretion of USDA offices how they wanted to administer them. And those offices proceeded to use their so-called discretion to systematically strip farmers of color of their land and resources over decades of discrimination, because the white folks that were hired to work in those offices refused to give loans and other services to their neighbors of color, or did provide loans and then used those as a means to take the land from their neighboring farmers, which drove those farmers off the land, drove masses of land loss for Black and Indigenous farmers while allowing white neighbors to acquire more land. And if you can go to the next slide, this is an opportunity for folks who want more background to learn more. So a landmark case that lets folks sort of learn about what that looked like was the Pigford versus Glickman lawsuit. And this is a picture of Timothy Pigford, who's an African-American farmer who was a plaintiff, the lead plaintiff on a massive landmark lawsuit that sued USDA for discrimination, and a settlement that came out of that lawsuit has resulted in millions of dollars of USDA having to pay farmers back for land that was taken as a result of discrimination. There have been several lawsuits that came after that case in different communities, Indigenous and Latinx communities, tracking similar discrimination, where USDA has had to provide massive amounts of repayments to people who lost their land as a result of these policies. So I posted a link in the chat for folks that want to learn more of that history and what that looked like. That case, the Pigford case, is a great way in to understand, and in some ways it's a victory, because while it shows the extreme extent of a land loss because of these policies and the way they were administered, it also is an example of people getting some of those losses remunerated, and many folks are using their settlement money to buy new land and continue to farm. So I invite you to learn more about that. But today, as a result of these policies, these systemic inequities, farmers of color are continue to be underrepresented in agriculture and tend to have smaller farms. And you can go to my next slide. So if we followed this graph way back, the percentage of land owned by Black farmers took a nosedive at the beginning of the century, but it is now on the rise. But the way that Farm Bill programs, the ones we're going to talk about, tend to work, they usually give you a per acre payment. So the larger your farm, the more you benefit from those programs. So that means they're mostly helpful to people who, for historical reasons, have had access to land and have larger farms. And who are those people? Those are white people. So on my next slide, I've got some numbers to kind of drive some of those facts home. So of course, farmers of color are underrepresented. 98% of US farmland is owned by white people. And just to remind you, white people, non-Hispanic white people, make up 60% of the total population, but they own 98% of the land. So that's really disproportionate. And farmers of color are continuing to experience land loss. And white farmers are continuing to access programs from USDA at disproportionate rates. And since we're going to talk about those programs, here's like even more detail on that. And I want to give a shout out to Kelsey Watson at National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, who I think is even on this webinar, who pulled some of this data together. In the next slide. I was fairly shocked by this. So we're going to talk later about Environmental Quality Incentives Program, EQIP, and the Conservation Stewardship Program. These programs, I'll give you more details on this later, but actually have some funding set aside specifically to support what USDA refers to as socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, which is sort of insulting way to talk about farmers of color. But that term sometimes includes other groups, so I'm going to use it because that's how the statistics are broken out. It from the last Farm Bill on also includes veteran farmers, so those numbers are a little bit inflated beyond just farmers of color. But the EQIP program provided over $1 billion of financial assistance. That's billion with a B, of which socially disadvantaged farmers, that's including farmers of color, received 13%. And let's remind ourselves that people of color represent 40% of the American population. In the conservation stewardship program, that data is given in acreage. And I thought this was particularly interesting because I'm going to talk about this, and I'm here in New York State. There are not a ton, 29,000, almost 30,000 acres in CSP in New York State. Want to know how many farmers of color are enrolled in that program? 0 so far, or we're in 2018 when we have the most recent data. So that's a huge opportunity. These programs have funding set aside. 5% of their funding is set aside to reach farmers of color, and that's by state. And that 5% is not going to any farmers of color in New York State. In total, in the whole country, a lot of acres are in CSP, over 11 million, 11.8 million. 7.5% of those acres are held by socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. Oh, thank you for clarifying the acronyms. I will use these ones as acronyms a few more times in today's conversation. So hold on to your hats. These are 2 acronyms to learn if you're interested in these programs. We will talk about them more soon. So that is some background on these programs. And holding this lens, like, I want folks to see these numbers, so that, like, that's why we're doing this webinar, because this money is sitting there. There's actually some set aside for farmers of color to use, and it's not being used. And the Pigford stuff, the long history of discrimination at USDA is a big part, obviously, of why folks are not entering those doors. But also in the Northeast, we are also really underrepresented, and other regions like us, where farms tend to be smaller, just don't have as many folks using conservation programs. So there's a great opportunity here for folks to, like, know that these programs exist and walk in the door and enroll. So that's why we're talking about them. And I just wanted to do the tiniest little, like, zoom out, holding this lens, understanding that, like, the Farm Bill is a piece of major US policy, acts to uphold existing structural inequities. I also just want to give you a very quick overview, big picture of, like, what else is in the Farm Bill. So I have one more slide on that. Thank you. So this is just our Farm Bill pie chart that gives you a sense of, like, overall where the money goes. And so I just don't want you to come out of this with the wrong impression that the Farm Bill is all about conservation programs. Most of the Farm Bill funding, as you can see, is actually, that big blue slice is nutrition programs. So that's things mostly the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, or food stamps, which is just a reflection, because that's an entitlement program. If you qualify, you can use it. That's a reflection of the extent of poverty in this country. And it uses the most of the Farm Bill dollars, because it's part of the same program, just in the same way that the early Farm Bills, like, took some surplus, bought up your extra grain, and supplied that in the form of food aid. We no longer do it exactly the same way, but the same bill authorizes that funding. But I also want to draw your attention to the red and yellow slices, which are commodity programs and crop insurance subsidies, which mostly go towards commodities. That's kind of the next biggest chunk. We're not really going to talk about using those things because they don't tend to work particularly well for smaller scale farmers. But those are programs that you can consider using if you want more detail on them. We have lots in the link I shared earlier on all the various Farm Bill programs, or I'm happy to talk to you about them. We're going to spend most of today talking about what's in the green slice, the conservation programs, and a little bit talking about what's in the purple 1% of the pie, everything else. Thank you for indicating with the mouse, that's very helpful. But this is, like, your overview of kind of what the Farm Bill does. It's a single biggest piece of US federal food and farm policy. It covers aspects all across the food system, everything from these sort of core agricultural programs, from direct subsidies to conservation programs, to helping people afford the food that grows on farms. And because of the history that we just talked about, the baked in white supremacy and racial injustice that exists in the food system and in the Farm Bill itself, like, that applies across the board here. And for the most part, especially the farm programs, who has access to those is a direct result of that history. So my next slide is going to have just a few reflection questions. And again, these come directly from my colleague Kelsey. So shout out to Kelsey. and my colleague Candace, who also helped put this piece together. So these are some questions to reflect on as you think about some of the information that I just shared. And they may apply to you different depending on what your identity is coming into this conversation, but especially for those of you who work in organizations that serve farmers, because I saw several folks in that bucket registered and on this call. It's a reminder to think about like what ways are we upholding systems of oppression in our food systems work, and then like what resources do we have access to, who do we serve with those resources and who don't we serve, who's left out, and how do we change that. So feel free to do some reflection on these questions, either like in the chat window if you want to share anything about your work or anything that came up for you as you were thinking about these structures. Also, please feel free to ask any questions. And thank you to someone who clarified that it is not just SNAP. And yes, so the nutrition program, the nutrition title is way bigger than SNAP. SNAP is most of the dollars, but also so actually school lunch and WIC are funded in a different piece of legislation, the Child Nutrition Act. So yeah, some of these programs are separate, in a separate piece of policy, but but there are a few other programs in the nutrition title beyond SNAP. Thanks for reminding us of that. Yeah, so if folks have other questions or want to point out other things that I might have slipped up or glossed over, please do. Otherwise, we are going to move into part 2. Next slide. So we are going to spend a little bit of time now talking about, okay, given all that context, given that those programs are not doing the job they should be of serving farmers of color, how can we access those programs? So I'm going to give you a few examples. Again, a reminder that I am not going to do every program. I would love to, but we don't have time. And I'm going to tell you about some that are open right now that you can make an appointment tomorrow to talk to your NRCS agent and apply to. So we're going to start with EQIP on the next slide. So this is a picture of my EQIP greenhouse. EQIP stands for Environmental Quality Incentives Program. I'm just curious because this is probably the conservation program that the most people use. Anyone on this chat use the EQIP program themselves? Feel free to just like pop into the chat with a quick yes, I have used EQIP, or maybe even what you used it for. Just curious if anyone has background here. And if maybe not, if you want to just let us know if you're familiar with it, like I know that program, yes, it's familiar. So EQIP provides grants for on-farm conservation projects to farmers, directly to farmers. It provides grants for a whole bunch of different practices. That's what they call them, conservation practices. There's a list of like over 200 different practices that you can use. I'm going to put the link in the chat to the NRCS webpage that's about this program. Thanks to folks for shouting out the ways you've used it. That's great. Thank you. And yeah, so there's the NRCS page, so you can look into it. Alexis pointed out that she is just in the process of applying, and it's so exciting. And she wants to know how long she has to wait, and USDA does not know the answer, and I'll get to that in a second. Yes, so there's the EQIP website, and you can poke around there and check out some of the practices that you can use these funds for. There's a long list. I used mine. We got this grant last year to build the high tunnel in this picture, and that in the picture is my cat Lefty and her best friend Pat, who's our NRCS agent. And high tunnels like this one are a pretty common thing that people use this program, especially vegetable growers like me use this program for, because they're a really expensive piece of equipment and they're considered a conservation practice because they enable us to provide local food. So that was really awesome for me. You can enroll right now in the EQIP program. And how do you do it? Next slide. It's super old school. You can't apply online. You have to talk to a human. It's not very millennial friendly. So to apply for EQIP, you have to talk to your NRCS agent. You can find them at your local NRCS office, and you can find that online. Fortunately, there is a way to start online. I'll post, I put a bit.ly that you can like type down out of my slide, but I'm also putting it in the chat. So that is where you can figure out the first step, which is like, who do I talk to? But then you're going to have to actually get to know that person quite a bit. And I wish this weren't the case, because this is where some of that discretion that the agents can use to bias, like that they're baked in bias that they may have just as a person raised in a racist society, might affect whose applications they prioritize and take seriously, or who they suggest they wait, another year to apply, or something that seems totally neutral, but might be an example of institutional racism. But knowing that barrier, knowing that you may face that barrier, the way to apply to this program is to build that relationship with your NRCS agent. So that person, you can call the office, you can walk in. If you're local, our ethic office is in the same building as Groundswell, which is pretty cool. So you could even go to Groundswell and say, hey, Alexis, want to come next door and help me talk to the NRCS agent? Our agent is actually new. Pat retired, and we have a new person, Erin, who's very nice and easy to work with, I think. Pat was too. And you can talk to them. So you can go in, make an appointment, call them on the phone, say you're interested in applying to EQIP. They'll have you fill out a form, and then they will come over to your farm and take a look. And to use this program, all you need to do is be growing food. You don't actually need to be selling that food. There are many different definitions of a farmer out there in the world, and NRCS does not use the definition that the same one as, say, the US Census of Agriculture, where you have to like sell at least $1,000 a year to qualify as a farmer. There are many other definitions out there. The only definition they care about is, are you producing food? And they want to do your project in an area where you're producing food. So you don't need to show sales records, and they shouldn't even ask you if you're selling the food that you produce. It's just about what you're growing, which is great, because some projects are more focused on food sovereignty and may be providing food without asking people to pay for it. And if that's you, or if you just started growing and you just haven't built up your sales markets yet, you can still use these programs. So the only requirements are that you are growing food, and that you have specific, they call them resource concerns, to meet. So your agent will come take a look, help you figure out what projects to work on. It might help you to take a look at their website, kind of see what options there are for you in terms of what projects you could consider, and then you could bring that to them. Advocating for yourself is always a really good idea. And then they'll help you fill out the forms. They'll put in the application for you. They'll have you sign some stuff, and let you know when you're set to start your project. And on my next slide, I want to tell you about something that's a really exciting new development when it comes to EQIP. There is now an advanced payment option. So the EQIP program historically has been a reimbursement grant. They'll reimburse the cost of your project, which is great, the full thing. They don't have you save receipts. They just want to see that you did it, and they have a flat rate that they will reimburse for a certain size, like at least for my greenhouse. They have a set rate. My greenhouse that's in this picture, my high tunnel, is 30 feet wide by 100 feet long. And the reimbursement that we got for that, and a little bit of like plantings around it that was part of the package, it was about $10,000. But that meant that I had to front $10,000 just in order to use this program. I had to go out and buy the equipment to build this greenhouse. which I fortunately could do locally. And I also was able to use some of that money to pay a crew of experienced greenhouse builders to put it up for me. You can also choose not to do that, and then you get to keep more of the reimbursement. But that's how I did it. I paid for it up front. But that means I had to have $10,000 on hand. So that means that program's not very accessible for people that have faced generations of systemic racial injustice and may not have $10,000 on hand, or people that may not have $10,000 on hand for any other reason. Like that just makes it less accessible. So fortunately, there's now an advance payment option, which means you can get some of that money up front. They do not give you the whole thing, but they will give you half of the cost of putting up your high tunnel or whatever project you're doing, that you can, so you can get half of that payment, then you do the rest of your project, and then you get the second half reimbursed. So one thing you could potentially do, at least in theory, would be to put, to take that first half to a loan agent, say, look, I'm enrolling in this program and I've got the first half paid, can I get the second half, and get a loan for the second half? Or do community crowdsourcing, however you can come up with that half of your project. But it is a start. It is better than nothing. So I just put a link in the chat to some more information about the EQIP advance payment option. It's a fairly new thing. You may find that your agent doesn't know a lot about it or isn't super comfortable using it. That doesn't mean you don't get to use it. You do. If you advocate for yourself, if you can come talk to us at NSAC, you can talk to folks at Groundswell. We can help advocate for you with your agent. But they should be letting you use that option. It's a little harder for them. They have to do more paperwork, so they may push back. That is not fair. It is available to you. So that is really exciting. And then the other thing I want to highlight, there's one more slide on EQIP, is just the fact that there are set-asides. So 5% of EQIP funding is set aside specifically for what they call socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, which includes farmers of color and also includes veteran farmers. Another 5% is set aside for beginning farmers. So that's farmers with less than 10 years of farming experience. So if you are in both of those pools, it just might mean that your application is more likely to get funded. You still have to be able to submit an application, so you still need to work with your agent, and there's still lots of opportunities for things to go wrong along the way there. But you should know that your application will go in a separate pool that gets that priority funding. All right, those are some basics on EQIP. I want to tell you one other exciting thing about EQIP. Well, I don't know how exciting it is, but this program is actually getting a little bit of an update. There were some changes made to the program in the Farm Bill that passed in 2018, and those changes are being rolled out right now by NRCS in the form of new rules, and they're open for public comment. And it's an opportunity. So some of the things beyond high tunnels that EQIP pays for are practices that are really science-based climate mitigation practices. So things like planting cover crops, and those practices aren't recognized in the EQIP rules as climate friendly or even soil health friendly practices. That's not a priority. So we have an opportunity to comment and tell them, hey, climate change is a big thing, and these are real climate mitigating practices that people can access, and the rule should prioritize that and should prioritize soil health. I wish I could tell you, click here on this link and make a comment, but we actually will have that page up next week at NSAC. We're just rolling out our comment campaign. So all I can tell you is, if you're curious about EQIP, if you care about climate change, if you want to weigh in on that, sign up for our updates, and we will make sure you hear about that next week when we get that comment center up and running. So that's our subscribe to our emails link again. Okay. Whew. Okay, so that's, I think, all I want to share about EQIP. If other folks have questions, about the program, feel free to throw them in the chat. And I'm going to talk about one other conservation program that's also open for application right now, also underutilized, and not making its way to enough farmers of color, which is the Conservation Stewardship Program. So that's my next slide. Thank you, thank you. So here's Pat again. He is petting my employee's dog. And then behind that picture, I have a picture of our cover crops that we planted as part of our enrollment in the Conservation Stewardship Program. The acronym we use for that is CSP. So this gives you just like a little glance into what the process is like. It's like a person will come to your farm with a folder full of paperwork and tell you where to sign, and you'll talk through it. You might say, wait, that's not what I thought, you know, and have them fix the paperwork. They'll bring it back. But that's like a little glimpse into what that process is like. So CSP is, the difference between CSP and EQIP is that it's sort of, CSP is considered like kind of a step up. It's a program that's intended to like reward good stewards. So in it, as opposed to EQIP, where you're going to get funding for doing something new, which kind of means that if you're already doing a maximum amount of like great stewardship on your farm, if you're doing every possible thing you could possibly do to be a regenerative, sustainable farmer, there's not a lot you can get funded for. They're not going to pay you for that. They're only going to pay you to add new things. And in some ways, the worse you're doing, the more opportunities you have to get funded by EQIP. So many farms are using it, for example, like confined animal feeding operations. CAPOs will use it to like put in giant manure lagoons, which like has environmental benefits over that manure running straight into our waterways, but is like maybe not the highest and best use and is very expensive. So like while EQIP kind of veers in that direction, although it can be very useful, CSP, the idea is to reward ongoing conservation efforts. So maybe you started doing something in EQIP and then you're going to go into the CSP program to continue that conservation work. And so they call their contracts conservation enhancements because they're going to enhance the conservation that you're doing. And they will, the way the rules are currently structured, you need to at least be doing something new to enroll in the program, but then they will actually pay you for the work that you're doing already in other areas of your farm, which is really exciting and really valuable. And it's, the how to apply process is very similar to EQIP. You can even apply at the same time. Like Alexis mentioned that she just like walked in and had a conversation about both programs with their agent. If you're already doing conservation, you are fair game. And something that's really cool about CSP is that, and this is on the next slide, I think, there is a new thing, a minimum payment. So while you might be doing a practice that's fairly affordable, like cover crop seed is not very expensive. I think in my contract, we're being paid like $19 a year to plant cover crops. But just for enrolling, just to make it worth your time, like if you're a really small farm and you don't have a lot of acres to enroll, you get a minimum payment of $1,500 a year. And each contract is for 5 years. So that actually is that times 5, but you just get it once a year. And what I found, our farm, like I said, it's 12 acres, it's pretty small. We don't have the whole farm enrolled in the program. And even still, we were able to, we did more than that. Like we're gonna be paid for enrolling in CSP, doing new practices of planting cover crops and planting fruit-bearing perennial trees. Our contract is going, because of some of the conservation work we were already doing, is paying us close to $4,000 a year over 5 years, which for my farm is really significant and a really great opportunity. I didn't do this yet, so I'm going to paste in the link to the NRCS page to learn more about the Conservation Stewardship Program in the chat there. Another thing to note about CSP is the set-asides, so that's on the next slide. Just the same as with EQIP, 5% of the funding is set aside to fund applications of socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. Again, that includes farmers of color and veteran farmers. And like we saw, like in New York, there were zero in 2018. So this is a huge opportunity. That's money that's like sitting there waiting to be used that isn't. So and this program, at least in my region, I know there are folks here from all over the place, but it's super underutilized in general. And partially that's probably because the agents aren't always game to be writing contracts for it, which is like not how it should be. Like they should be writing contracts for people for whom it applies, but that's not always the case. So it sometimes just means you need to go in and advocate for yourself around using that program. There are lots of different enhancements on that link that I just pasted in. You can learn more about all the various projects that you could do with a CSP contract. And it's a really exciting opportunity. Similar to Equip, the CSP projects, the enhancements they're going to fund you to do are often really excellent ways to sequester carbon in the soil and fight climate change on your farm, making your farm both like a regenerative farm that's doing things that are like actively good for the environment, and also that you'll be more like you'll be able to weather changes in extreme weather as a result of climate change better, like because you'll have more soil organic matter and more perennial crops, and like it's a pretty cool climate tool. I should note, USDA will not tell you that. The Trump administration has taken the word climate change out of any of USDA's stuff. They use soil health as a term, and sometimes that refers to climate change. And they also use the words weather volatility, which is a direct synonym for climate change when they mean climate change. Like when they're talking about adaptation, when you need to like do stuff to make your farm less vulnerable to the effects of climate change, they'll use the words weather volatility. So that's what they really mean. But these programs are kind of awesome. They're like, while we're waiting on comprehensive federal climate policy to happen, these programs exist, and they are already ways that farmers can access funding to do stuff that you might already be doing or you might already want to do, that will make your farm more climate resilient and reduce your climate impacts. And $1,500 a year might also increase your like bottom line and help you be more resilient economically, which is huge. And these programs, like that's part of what they're there for. So that's a little bit on CSP. Again, if folks have questions or thoughts and you want to put them in the chat box, please do. This is the tip of the iceberg as far as information goes. NSAC has many more resources that I'm happy to share if you're serious about applying to these programs. Someone just put in a question and just wanted to clarify this because it's a really good question. Do you need a minimum in sales in order to qualify for these programs? No. Isn't that interesting? No. All you need to be doing is growing food. They are not going to ask what you're selling it for. You just need to be growing food and stewarding your environment, and you can do it. And this is a really good question about CSP contracts lasting 5 years and land tenure. Like what do you do if you have a lease that's less than 5 years? That's a really good question. I'm not going to get into all of the details there because it's sort of a complicated answer. There are different ways to do it. Tenants can apply for CSP. You might need a plan to hand off. I don't think there are less than 5 year contracts, but your landlord could apply, or you could apply and just plan to hand it off to someone else. But that is really tricky. That is a barrier for sure. And there's also a question around, do you need a minimum amount of land to enroll in these programs? And no, despite the fact that like I have what's considered a small farm, but I have 12 acres. It's bigger than the urban farms that I came up on. You like, part of my stuff is only happening on a tiny fraction of an acre, and that's okay. So no, you can use these programs on very small amounts of land. Oh, and thank you to Liz at Groundswell for clarifying that you need to show a 5 year lease to qualify your leased land. So yes, that's complicated and a barrier and something to address. any other questions, feel free to type them into the chat. There's one more program that I want to talk about that's open right now that farmers can apply for directly. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of programs in a bit less detail that organizations can apply for. So I'm going to ask for next slide. So one other program to know about, this is not a conservation program. Not that it's for farmers that don't practice conservation, but it's a totally separate piece of USDA, not the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which I keep using the acronym NRCS to apply to. The Value Added Producer Grant Program is a grant program that you can get for your farm if you are thinking about a new enterprise or expanding an existing enterprise that, like the name says, like adds value to something that you produce. For example, processing some of your vegetables, like to sell them as pickles or jam. If you're a dairy producer, processing your milk into cheese or yogurt. There are grants. There's like different levels of these grants. One that is a planning grant to kind of suss out what you would need to do to apply, like, or what you need to do to start that project. So like a feasibility study is a common thing people will get that funding to do. And then there are a different version of that grant that's for like actually enacting the project itself. I put some links here in my slide, and I am going to also paste those into the chat. NSAC, National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, my organization, has a guide to applying to the Value Added Producer Grant Program, and I'm going to paste that in. It says it's for 2017, but it's pretty applicable to this year's as well. And then I'm also going to paste in the link on USDA. Unlike the conservation programs, you can apply online to this program. And our guide will walk you through that. Because we have that full guide, basically what I'm doing by putting this in this presentation is just letting you know that 1, it exists, 2, it's open, and you can apply for it right now. And then a few other like very basic pieces of information which you can also find in our guide about that program. One thing to know is just that there is now a simplified application for smaller projects. And to give you a sense of scope on the size project that Value Added Producer Grant Program is intended for, a smaller grant is grant is considered smaller if it's under $50,000. So this is a pretty big thing. The other main thing to know about this program is that it is a matching grant. So this is another huge equity barrier, because in order to get the money, and remember, if a small grant is $50,000, you need to come up with an equal amount of money yourself to put into your project. So you would need to fund a project that show that your project is twice as big as the amount of money that you are asking for. You can also use in-kind matching, but still it is a pretty huge barrier. And I'm just going to direct folks to our guide that I linked to, because it's going to answer most of the basic questions around the Value Added Producer Grant Program. A lot of folks, oh my gosh, thank you, Molly. Wow, I have the wrong link. Thank you, Molly, for putting in the updated version. Wow, great. Molly is our fabulous grassroots fellow at NSAC and worked on this, and sorry for not having it. It is needing updating on our website, but appreciate that. So yes, lots of information there for folks that are interested. People tend to use this for either figuring out new ways to market existing products, figuring out new ways to process products that they're already working on, and lots of folks happen to use it for like cider, alcohol related processing. So if you are an orchardist and you want to do cider, that's a huge use of that program. There are also, in statute at least, some set-asides with the value-added producer grant program. I think this is on my next slide. 20% of the program is supposed to be set aside, but we have found some holes in whether or not the set-asides are really happening, which is a longer story than I'll get into now, but at least in statute, like, if you somehow come up with the resources to apply despite like the systemic barriers that those set-asides are intended to address, and that the program as a whole has some ways to go before it finishes addressing them, then you will be put in a pool that puts your application closer to the front of the line. I do not think I can answer. I have not personally applied for VAPG, and I am not as much of an expert on it. If folks want to try me with questions, you may, but I may not have all the answers. I just want to let you know that it exists and it's open. But feel free to try. And now I want to talk a little bit more about that program, a couple of programs that are relevant to our discussion today, that if you are here on behalf of an organization, while yes, please tell your farmers about these programs. There are some programs, there are many, many, many other, probably more Farm Bill programs that you can apply to directly. So on the next slide, I have one that's a huge landmark program. So I talked a lot at the beginning about how the Farm Bill reflects systemic inequity, and most of the programs, with no exception here, like work better for those who have more resources to begin with. But this is a program, the Arctic Assistance to Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers program, which is colloquially known as by its line in the original statute that authorized it, Section 2501. This is a program that's intentionally designed to counteract that fact. This is a program that exists to support farmers of color, and now also works for veteran farmers in accessing farm programs that they may face barriers to accessing because of the history we just talked about. So I just put this picture here from the Groundswell website because Groundswell has used this program or hosts on this webinar today. These are some of the farmers in the incubator farm that Groundswell runs, and they have used this program to support that type of programming. 2501 provides grants to non-governmental organizations, which can include nonprofits and universities and institutions and tribal entities, to specifically do work with farmers of color, to make sure, to provide like a long suite of services that also includes like helping them walk in the door and access programs that USDA has had a hard time making sure they access. So that is not a program that individual farmers can apply for. However, there are likely resources that if you are an individual farmer, you may have accessed some resources that were funded by this program for training, for support, for resources. This one is not open for application now. So again, with the if you want to know more about 2501 or hear when it opens, sign up for our updates. But know that it's out there. And I'm sure I imagine most organizational folks that are on this call have heard of this program before. The other big one when it comes to serving farmers directly on my next slide is Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program, this is an interpretive collage that someone made about it at the NSAC, Northeast Sustainable Ag Working Group Conference last year. This is another one that nonprofits apply for directly and provides resources to provide training and other forms of support for beginning farmers. And this one also has set-asides. So some of the funds are specifically allocated for folks who are working with farmers of color and veteran farmers. So that's another thing to know about this program. There's set-asides here. Again, not open at the moment, and awards were just announced, but something to think about, which folks are probably familiar with if you're a service provider and working with farmers. Okay, and I mentioned earlier that I would not be giving the complete list. So obviously, if you're coming here from an organization, you might feel like, oh, bummer, I really want to know about programs I'm not already using. Again, we have a full list on our website. I wanted to bring in one other kind of oddball one, just because it does happen to be open right now, and we're having conversations about it like in the moment. So one more programs for organizations slide. So there's kind of a funny oddball one, which NRCS has put out. They put out last month that's a grant for conservation collaboration, and this is specifically a grant that lets that's providing funding. It's like $35 million of funding for organizations who want to do outreach about NRCS conservation programs. So that would include the two that we talked about earlier, the Conservation Stewardship Program and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. So it's funding for organizations to do outreach about those programs, specifically with underserved farmers, and that specifically includes farmers of color, veteran farmers, and other low resource farmers and beginning farmers. So I just wanted to make a plug for this because it's right now happening. You can apply from any region. I just wanted to mention it because I happen to be like hosting a conversation with a bunch of folks in the Northeast. So both my region, New York, New England, and the Mid-Atlantic region today at 4. So if you're interested in that, put it in the chat and I'll get back to you, or send me an email. Like we can talk about how you can plug into that. Someone asked if this is happening in other regions. It's nationwide. It can be any region. I just happen to work in the Northeast, so I'm putting a plug for Northeast folks. But that is an opportunity that happens to be open now. Yes, and so obviously not the full list, and our much longer list exists on our website. I'm going to put that link in the chat again. And I want to make a couple of other notes about this stuff. So in my next slide here, I want to make a note about transferring resources. So in a similar way to the fact that our farmer serving programs that are delivered directly by USDA to farmers tend to serve white farmers better because of historical inequities, that same pattern plays out across programs that serve organizations directly. Organizations that benefit from intergenerational transfer of wealth and like through white families and thus and white leadership of organizations tend to get more of these resources, even those that are directly intended to serve farmers of color. So there's some irony there that white-led organizations tend to do better in applying for this funding for lots of historical reasons around who has had access to resources. So this is a note specifically to note that, and to remind folks to ask yourselves, like, if you work for a historically white-led organization that has successfully accessed USDA programs in the past, this is a good time to start thinking about, like, how can you share that expertise with Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led groups. That's that acronym BIPOC on my slide. Like, for example, if you have a grant writer, could that person offer some hours to co-write a grant for a BIPOC organization? Could you write that organization into your proposal? And at the very least, a reminder that if you're writing a grant and you're expecting folks to participate in any programs that you run, a best practice to remember is to pay people for their time, especially people whose time is undervalued elsewhere through our systems of systemic racism. So that's like a one tiny best practice to include in your grant proposal, but like back up and think about how you could access those resources. And then this is an appropriate place, but there are many even more appropriate places to mention if you're someone that's like definitely works on programs like this and is looking for collaborators, or if you're an organization that is POC led and looking for maybe some support from a paid grant writer if that's not something your organization has. Obviously, it's worth noting here, not all BIPOC-led organizations are low resource. There certainly are. It's not a fair assumption that just because an organization is led by people of color that don't have access to resources, but structurally that is more likely to be the case. So if you are an organization that has faced those structural barriers and you're looking to partner, feel free to pipe up now. But yes, like this is also something to think about from that side, partnering with organizations who may have more resources, which may put them at an advantage when looking for this funding. So that is just a note towards that. And one more plug on my next slide for more resources. I really, as you can see, we're already have less than 15 minutes left for questions. So if you want more, if you are curious about a program that wasn't, we didn't address today, please check out our list. And I put a bit.ly there, I put the link in a couple of times, and this is what that website looks like. So that's what you'll see when you get there, but feel free to go and check out those more resources. Really happy to have folks find them. And then I have just my last slide to say, like, there are lots of upcoming advocacy opportunities about this work that we've been talking about these programs or ways to make them better. We've talked about lots of shortcomings that they have. So if you are interested in doing advocacy work, a great way that I can offer you to be involved is to sign up for our updates. So our next slide has a recommendation to do that, a link. Oh, wait, maybe that link doesn't, no, wait, yes, it does. Next slide, we'll have that. Yeah, so you can sign up for that, or if you just send me your email through the notes, the chat, I can make sure you get signed up. Yeah, and now I'm going to take a few questions. We've got like 8 more minutes for the questions. I'll start with some of the questions folks have already put in the chat because I'm behind on a few of those. Excuse me. And oh, and thank you to the person who just pointed out that you can save the chat with all the links for yourselves, which is a really great point. I didn't know how to do that. Thank you for mentioning that. Yes, and so, okay, I'm gonna go back and talk through a couple of things. Another way to get these links, I have been, for my own ease of use, using a Google Doc where I just dumped all my links. And so I'm just going to paste a link to that you can have if you just want the links. Here you go. Let's back up because I think there was one more CSP question that I didn't get to hit. But yes, please feel free to put more questions in the chat. And thank you. I see some that are appreciative, and I am so grateful to all of you for being here and being part of this conversation. It felt like there really was some back and forth from all of you who were up in the chat. So thank you so much, everyone, for your keen attention and work on that. And actually, then the last slide is going to just have wait, no, this one is going to be the question slide, which is cute because that's baby cow. Oh. So please feel free to ask questions. And then the next slide is going to have my contact info for folks who would like to reach out to me directly. So you want to just leave it on the less cute, no baby cow version. It's the next slide. Okay, and someone asked a question that's a really good question around, a couple of good CSP questions. Can you apply to CSP multiple times? Yes, you should be able to do CSP at the end of your contract. But that is a more complicated question. If you move land and purchase property, that is a really good question. Something would happen to the land, you would be breaking your contract if you stopped using it on the land where you were, but you would be eligible on the new land. So that would be a ask your agent type question. But thank you to Abigail for helping clarify that. And then somebody asked a question around, do you need to grow vegetables, or can farming with animals apply? And that's an excellent question. Sorry, my bias is towards vegetable farming because that's me, that's what I do. but that is not a prerequisite for using any of these conservation programs. They certainly work great for livestock farmers. There are lots of programs very specific to livestock. For example, fencing, keeping animals out of sensitive waterways. These programs can pay for fencing for that, which is a huge expense. They can also, lots of stuff to help with like manure management. So yeah, definitely check these out for folks who are working with animals. And I'm going to look for some more questions. Noting that Groundswell will send folks links. I can also make my slides available. Lex, can you go to the last slide with my contact info for folks too? Thank you for folks who shared their emails. I will put you on our list. Ooh, and a reminder that there is an evaluation form, which will be up here soon. Ooh, and then this is a really good question about commercial biochar production as a value-added farm project. I do not know the exact answer to that, but I do know you do not have to produce food. You can produce, that there are value-added producer grant funding opportunities for compost products and other things that you don't eat. So I would imagine that biochar will qualify, but I don't know the exact answer and I don't want to lie to you. So good question about that. Our guide might make it more clear. Thanks, folks. Alexis might be about to pipe up about this, but looks like an evaluation form is available. So folks, feel free to please share your thoughts. Let us know what I missed, what we want to talk about in the future. Looking for other questions. Anything else you are dying to know? Thank you for all the appreciations. I appreciate you. All right. I am seeing the questions die down.
I want to thank you, Ariana, for an amazing sharing of all of this information. I mean, me personally, I was left with like 0 questions. Like all the questions I had were answered, which is amazing.
Thank you.
And then, yeah, for those of you who can't see the chat box and might have missed it when Ariana said it a moment ago, I will be sending an email out to all of those who registered. So that includes the people that were here at Zoom, and then those who couldn't make it. I will share the links that Ariana has posted in the chat box during the talk. I will share the recording of this webinar, and then I will also share the slides as per Ariana today. So you will be left with all of the resources in any form. So
thank you so much. And one other thing I should mention is just that you might have seen Molly pop up with the added VAPG guide from NSAC, and like our fellows in our office actually will answer your questions about these programs too. So if you pick up the phone and call our office, that's my cell phone number on my slide, but if you go to sustainableagriculture.net, you can just like email our info at or call our office, and like there's a real person that can help you answer if you find yourself with other questions and you're just looking for a place to start. Your agent for NRCS is always a good person, but our office, I can do my best, but I'm not an expert on everything. But our fellows are really great at like putting it on their list to get back to you if they don't know an answer. And we have experts on all of these programs because we helped write them. So please be in touch if you find yourself with more questions, because we want you to access these resources and put them to work on your farms and in your projects. And thank you so much to Alexis for hosting and Groundswell. Ooh, somebody just made a really great point in the chat. Thank you, Abigail. Yes, so good point. NRCS has local working group meetings and state technical committee meetings, and these are good places to share any boundaries you're facing, which is a really good point. And also, you can run and be on those technical committees, and that's a great way to support like bringing a lens, like a racial equity lens, into those rooms. They can often be rooms full of white people looking at your application. So running, like just helping add age diversity, gender diversity, racial diversity to those rooms is super important, and a really cool way to sort of like start out a career in public service if you're interested in like a quick volunteer elected office. So think about your local NRCS state technical committees. That's a great way to get involved. Thank you for pointing that resource out, Abigail. And then there's also a question from Daniel about grant writing. Are there any resources for that by chance? And that's a really good question. I could interpret it two ways. Like, I don't know of like a public resource that's just sitting there waiting to help farmers write grants. Like the value added producer grant obviously takes a bunch of writing. I don't know of a good resource for that, but like there may be people from organizations on this chat that have that expertise that may be able to support you or point you in the right direction. That's a good question if anyone else wants to pipe up on that. But we're at time, so I don't want to take up the rest of your afternoons. Thank you all so much for being part of this conversation and all of the incredible work that you do on your farms and beyond. I'm taking a peek at all your faces now, and it's really fun. And I recommend you all do that as you say goodbye. So thanks, everybody.
Thank
you soon.
you.
Be in touch.
Yeah.